So this week, though, we're going to talk about something briefly. We're going to talk about what it means to have a new mind. Many of you probably saw this clip, but it's just worth watching over and over and over again. This was about 3 weeks ago after the Chiefs had won the Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes was in a parade, and he was up on a bus, and he threw a football into the crowd, and this man happened to be standing there, and he tried to catch it, and it didn't go very well. So watch this clip. You'll have to watch it several times because it's hard to see on the first run. So go ahead and run this clip. So there's no sound. So Mahomes is up on that bus. He's out in front. He throws the ball. And that man, I don't know if you saw it. We're going to have to replay it. Right into the parking meter. And we're going to have to show it one more time. I mean, boom! I love this for so many reasons. One is the perfect snow angel at the very end. I mean, look at this. Wow. I mean, what a great video. I mean, this is just... The guy has achieved fame. This is it. This is the pinnacle of his life. I do love that video for several reasons. But if you think about this guy, he's going to get up the next morning and see that he's all over the internet. And you got to know that at some point he had to say to himself, what was I thinking? It's a big crowd of people. Mahomes throws the football. What are the chances of me catching it? I'm not looking where I'm going. What was I thinking? And I guarantee you at least one answer to that question is not about the parking meter. He was not at all thinking about running into that parking meter. And the truth is, you and I, we have a lot of times in life where we find ourselves saying the same thing, which is just what was I thinking? A lot of times we have this thought when we look at an old picture of ourselves and we see the certain jeans we're wearing or how high our pants are hiked up or how low the bangs are, and we just look at the picture and think, what was I thinking? There's a picture that we show about every 5 years, and it's been about 5 years, so let's just look at this picture here. One more. Scott, what were you thinking? Do you got anything? I'm guessing you weren't thinking. You probably weren't thinking. Yeah, that's it. But we all have stories. We all have stories like this. I have a really strange one from my childhood. Really weird story here. I'm 7. Oh, yeah. We can move on. We can move on. Thanks, Scott. Thanks. That's good. It's a lot of power there. So I'm 7, and I'm doing a craft in the kitchen. And I accidentally spill a big glob of Elmer's glue on my hand. We're talking a big glob the size of a quarter. I'm walking to the sink to wash it off, and I get distracted by the TV, and I watch it for just 30 seconds. And then when I look back at my hand, something switches in my brain, and I forget that it's glue. And I just look, and I just think, oh, I must have spilled milk on my hand. And so I just lick it up like a cat. And again... Right as I did it, I'm thinking, what was I thinking? And again, the answer is, I wasn't thinking. And the truth is, you and I do this all the time. You think to yourself, well, I don't really need to study for the test. And then you fail the test. And then afterwards, you're like, what was I thinking? Maybe you're going to send a text message, and this isn't going to be misunderstood. And then you hit the send button, and the person gets mad at you, and you think, what was I thinking? Or maybe you're about to drive downtown, and you think, oh, it's not rush hour, 235 and I-44, it's not going to be bad today. And then you get down there, say it with me, what was I thinking? We do this all the time, and the truth is we're not. We're not thinking. So this morning, I want to give thought to our thoughts. Because behavior, in many ways, derives from our thinking. Nearly every facet of your life starts in your mind. That the project that you're doing at home right now, that started in your mind. That horrible thing that you said to your friend that hurt their feelings and damaged the relationship, that started in your mind. So if you think what you've always thought, you're going to do what you've always done. So we're going to look at several passages today, mainly out of the book of Romans. And we're going to start in chapter 1. And this is a part of the Bible where Paul is describing just how fractured and twisted and messed up the world is. And he says that all the problems you see in the world are really at their root a worship problem. So he says that people have worshiped created things rather than creator. And this leads to this host, this massive list of sins. And so I want to read that list. Romans 1, verse 28. Paul says this. He's describing this group of people that have fallen away from God. They did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. So God gave them over, meaning that, in other words, God allowed the natural consequences to take place. So God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not be done. So why are they doing what they're doing? Well, it's because they're thinking the way that they're thinking. So the behavior is coming from the thoughts. And then Paul gives this very heartwarming list. He says they've become full of every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity. They're full of envy and murder and strife and deceit and malice. They're gossipers, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. So where did all of this junk originate? If you go back to the beginning of the verse, it comes from a depraved mind. So depraved behavior comes from a depraved mind. And so as Paul goes through this amazing book of Romans, a lot of the letter is spent describing how everybody's fallen. Like the Jews, they're messed up, they're sinful, they're broken. The Jews have an arrogance about them. They think that they're the only ones. But then the Gentiles, they're fallen too. And Paul talks a lot about them. The Gentiles have more of an ambivalence. We're just going to do whatever we want to do. And so a lot of Romans is Paul saying everybody's broken, everybody's fallen. There's a famous verse where Paul says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Everybody is in this boat. And so when Paul starts talking about God, really God's role in the book of Romans is that God is faithful to save his people, and God doesn't abandon them, and he doesn't abandon his plan. And really, in the book of Romans, it's all about the faithfulness of God, this God who goes to great lengths to save his people. Especially if you get to Romans 9, chapter 11, God does astonishing things to save his people. Well, then I want to fast forward all the way to chapter 12, where Paul says this. He says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." And then he goes on to say this, and this is the verse I really want to look at it for a few minutes here. He says this in verse 2, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world." And the thing that I find really interesting here is that Paul looks out at the world and he uses the word pattern to describe his culture. So he's looking out at the norms of his society, at the sociological trends, and he's noticing that there's a pattern there. And when you think about a pattern is really just, I think there's two characteristics of patterns. They're noticeable and they're repeatable. So a lot of you are wearing shirts with patterns on them. If you got a pattern on your shirt, that means it's noticeable and it's repeatable. And so Paul's looking at his culture, and he's articulating that there are things that are noticeable and repeatable about this culture that form a pattern. And he's saying, don't be conformed to that pattern. So I'm writing this sermon the other day, and I start thinking about our world and our pattern, and I'm at my desk, and I literally just do this. And I start thinking about what kind of patterns that our culture portrays. And so I start thinking about, like, okay, if we just took some time to analyze what we see on TV and the commercials that we watch and everything we see on social media, like, what are the patterns of our culture today? And I came up with 10 things, and here they are. And we'd come up with 100. You can come up with a list of your own. But here they are. Something is true if it feels true. Number 2, now is better than later. And again, these are just messages that we hear from our culture today. Number 3, more is better than less. Accomplishing is better than resting. Sex is a commodity. Here's another message I think our culture sends about sex. The best sex life is one without boundaries. Here's one about humor. Humor is a necessary weapon used to demean the people around you. The digital self takes precedence over the actual self. Death is a downer, deny it. And money equals happy. So again, you could come up with your own list, but as I look at our culture, as I look at our world, this is the pattern. And these are repeatable things, these are noticeable things that if you just watch TV for 2 hours this afternoon, these are the kinds of messages that you will see and that you will hear. And what's interesting is that it takes no intentionality to adopt these values. Yeah, like if you wake up tomorrow morning and you just go on autopilot, this is the pattern that you will adopt because it's so strong, it's so pervasive, it actually takes no self-control, it takes no discipline to be patterned by the world. But Paul says in Romans chapter 12 again, he says, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world. Instead, and here's what he says next, he says, be transformed. So he's really playing on words here. Don't be conformed, instead be transformed. And so when we read the word transformed, or at least when I read the word, I actually think of Transformers like Optimus Prime or Bumblebee. That is not what Paul has in mind. Because modern day Transformers, they can like transform in a matter of seconds. But the Greek word here is actually metamorpho, which is where we get our modern day word metamorphosis. And so what Paul really has in mind is a process here. Think of a butterfly coming out of a cocoon. It doesn't happen in a day. There's a process of transformation. So in other words, Paul's saying, yes, there's a pattern in this world and you don't have to be conformed to it. And the way that you don't be conformed to it is you go through a process of transformation. And here's how the transformation actually works. Next line, Paul says this, be transformed, and say this red part with me, by the renewing of your mind. Isn't that amazing that the problem which started the whole book in Romans 1, a depraved mind, he now comes back to in chapter 12 by saying, hey, if you want to be transformed, it actually starts with what is going on in your brain. In other words, we need to think about thinking. If you think the way you've always thought, you will do what you have always done. Your words, your actions, your behaviors come from your mind. And so if you want to be the kind of person that can get up in this kind of patterned world and not be completely absorbed by the pattern, then it begins in your mind. In other words, changing your world begins with changing your mind. It all starts with what's going on in your head. And I think that it's amazing that Paul wrote this so long ago, because there's actually been so many discoveries in modern neuroscience which really support what Paul is saying a long time ago. So for example, there's this neuroscientist named Richard Hanson. He's done, his whole life's work is about how the brain works. And he wrote this in one of his books. He said, if you regularly rest your mind upon worries, self-criticism, and anger, then your brain will gradually take that shape. Your brain will develop neural structures and dynamics of anxiety, low sense of worth, and prickly reactivity to others. And so in other words, what his research has proven is that the thoughts that you think the most actually change the shape of your brain. And so one illustration you might think about is this. So imagine there's two highways, side by side. And one of the highways, it's just semis going up and down the whole time. And the other highway, it's just motorcycles. Now, you give those two highways 10 years, and the roads are going to look really different because of the kinds of vehicles that travel upon them. Well, Hanson's saying your brain's the same way. And so the thoughts that you entertain the most often actually shape the way that your brain works. Your mind will conform to the most traveled train of thought. And many of us, we have been stuck in negative thought patterns for a long time. In fact, some of us have been stuck so long that we don't even, we just think it's normal, these kinds of thoughts that we think. And so what Paul is saying, again, is he's saying it is possible for your mind to be renewed. And so how exactly do we do this? I want to go to a different passage of Scripture. This is a really short one, it's 2 Corinthians chapter 10, but I think it's really practical. Here's what Paul says in verse 5. He says, take captive every thought. Take captive every thought. So I want to get super practical here. I've got 3 thoughts about controlling thoughts. And the first one is this. If you want to renew your mind, the first thing you got to do is you got to notice that the thoughts are even there. For a lot of us, we're so used to these thought patterns that we don't even recognize that they are dysfunctional and that they are destructive. And so the first step is really to acknowledge that they are there. Again, part of the reason we struggle capturing, arresting, and submitting our thoughts is we don't even recognize that we're having the thoughts. And so I want to put them all on the table here. So for a minute, I want to introduce you to some of the friends that live in my brain that sometimes I don't realize they're there, but I've been trying to do a better job of calling them out, and I've given them names. So here's the first one. You've heard of CBD. This is actually CBT, or I guess if we're getting technical, it's ICBT, and here's what it is. I can't believe they. Has anybody ever had this thought live in their brain? Just raise your hand if you've ever thought this one. Anybody? And maybe I'll explain it and then it may make more sense. So this one goes like this. I can't believe they said that to me. I can't believe this person cut me off in traffic. I can't believe that this person planned this party and they didn't consult my calendar first. This is ridiculous. I can't believe she posted that online. Can't believe he wore that in public. Okay, so now that I'm explaining this, how many of you have had this friend live in your head before? It happens. CBT. All right, CBT has a friend named ING. ING is I'm never going to. We'll add a 2 on there. So here's how this one works. I'm never going to get out of debt. Never going to lose weight. I'm never going to finish this assignment. Never going to find a relationship. I'm never going to get that job. Again, let's keep the honesty going. How many of you have ING living in your brain? I'm never gonna. Here's a third friend. We're just going to call this one ISH, I-S-H. I should have. I should have got more done. I should have written that card. Should have made that phone call. Should have ate less. Should have watched TV less. Should have exercised more. Should have prayed more. I should have. One more time. How many of you have this one in your head? You good friends with Ish? Some of you are like best friends with Ish. Now here's one more. I call this one TMT, which stands for they must think. They must think I'm boring. They must think I'm ugly. They must think I'm insecure. They saw my toddler drop a jar of mayonnaise and break it in the grocery store. They must think I'm a bad parent. Like we think this one all the time. They must think. And I do have to say about this one, you have no idea what they're thinking. And I have no idea what somebody else is thinking. When you think about what they think, you're not thinking about what you think. And when you're not thinking about what you think, you are living in an imaginary mind of somebody else that you made up. So I know that TMT is real, but we got to push it aside, say, no, not today. And sometimes, you know what happens is all 4 of these friends can show up together. So here's how this might work. So first is Ish, and you might say this to yourself, I shouldn't have rambled so much in that conversation. But then CBT comes up and you say, I just can't believe that I did that. And then TMT shows up and you say to yourself, well, they must think I'm an idiot. And then finally ING shows up and then so you says, I'm just never going to speak again, ever. It's like they can all show up all the time and they are real. In fact, I'll give you a few more. I won't talk about these as much, but these also live in my brain sometimes. There's no point. I'm a failure. No one cares. And this will never end. So all I'm saying is there's a lot of relatives in this family of negative thoughts. And what Paul says is he says take them captive. And so the first thing we got to do is we got to notice that they're there. Everybody say notice. You just got to call them out. But here's the second thing that I think we can do to take control of our thoughts. And it has to do with what Jesus did in a conversation with Peter. So as Paul talks in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, take captive every thought. And then the next thing he says is make it obedient to Christ. So you remember that story where Jesus is talking to Peter and Peter says, hey, Peter, Jesus, you don't want to die. You don't want to go to the cross. This is not going to be a good thing. Well, that's a thought that Peter's putting in Jesus' mind. And we actually know that later Jesus does entertain this thought. Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is like, yeah, I don't want to die. Well, how did Jesus handle this thought that Peter put in Jesus' mind? Well, here's what Jesus says. Mark chapter 8. Jesus looks at Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And so here's the second thing you can do is you can rebuke it. Like you can notice that it's going on in your head, and then you can just call it out. In fact, I've actually, you're going to think I'm kind of silly here, but I do this sometimes when I'm driving all by myself. I call out the negative thought patterns. Like I will speak out loud. I will say, "I see you, ing. I see you, and you're not in my house, not today." Like I rebuke it. And if you drive by me and you see me talking, I'm probably talking to myself. But I think that this is something we can practice. You can learn to recognize the negative thought patterns, and then you can learn to rebuke them. And let me give you one more thing. So everybody say notice. Everybody say rebuke. And here's the third and final thought about thoughts. We're going to go to Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Paul says this. "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy," say this word with me, "think about such things." So here's the third thought. So you got to notice the thoughts, you got to rebuke the thoughts, and then you just have to outnumber them. One way to deal with negative thoughts is simply to drown them out, to overwhelm them with the positive thoughts. So 3 weeks ago when we had our big Lee Strobel event, this room was actually full of a lot of you, but then so many guests were coming in that many of you had to leave to Fellowship Central that I heard turned into a sauna. It was super, super hot. But if you think about what happened on that day, there were so many people coming in that some of you were simply crowded out. I think what Scripture is saying, especially in Philippians 4, is that this can happen in your mind. When you make it a habit of filling your mind with helpful, positive, excellent, praiseworthy thoughts, then it simply becomes a math game. Your negative thoughts just don't have enough room to be in your mind. And I can testify to this personally. Like when I am consistently filling my brain with Christ-centered books and Christ-centered podcasts and Christ-centered conversations with people that love Jesus, then guess what's in my mind? Christ. It's just a numbers game. I've outnumbered the negative thoughts, so now Christ is actually dwelling in my mind. Again, we'll go back to Richard Hanson, this modern-day neuroscientist. He says this, on the other hand, if you regularly rest your mind upon, for example, noticing you're all right now, seeing the good in yourself and letting go, then your brain will gradually take the shape of calm strength, self-confidence, and inner peace. So again, what he's saying is that your brain will form to the thoughts that you give it. So a few months ago, some friends of ours, Andrew and Lindy Krebs, challenged my family to something, and a lot of you have maybe done this. This has been talked a lot about in the last 5 years. We did the 31-day gratitude challenge. Here's what the 31-day gratitude challenge is. Every day for 31 days, you have to write down 7 things you're grateful for. And at first, it's super easy. And then you get to like day 16, and you're not allowed to repeat anything. So like on day 16, 17, you're now in like, you've written like 100 things that you're grateful for, and you're struggling to find things to be grateful for. And so you really have to think critically, okay, what am I grateful for? So I was reading through just stuff we said that we were thankful for. And so all of us did this. Mary did this, I did this, my girls did this. So at first we wrote down things like, okay, we're thankful for compassion, faithful people. We're thankful that God defeated sin. And then we said things like, about midway through, we said we're thankful for good challenges, thankful for days that aren't busy, thankful for looking at Christmas lights. And then one day I didn't have anything. And we had just watched Star Wars. And so I said, Lord, thank you for Yoda's funny voice. I was just really thankful for that. I said, Lord, thank you for Amazon Prime. And then one day, Heidi wrote in her journal, Lord, thank you for the times when Anna is not mad at me. And then Anna the same day wrote, Lord, thank you for times when Heidi is not mad at me. And so all in all, what happened here is like we had to get really creative about being grateful. And then something amazing happened on like day 27 or so. We always did this at the end of the day. But in the middle of the day, I'm just driving my car, and I start feeling really grateful at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I start thinking of, this thing just happened. I'm going to write about this in my journal tonight. And so what had happened is, even in a short period of time, 31 days, my brain was changing. And I was starting to become a more grateful person simply by building up those thought patterns in my mind. What Paul is saying is possible, because what happened to me in December is that I was transformed by the renewing of my mind. This can be possible for you too. So everybody, say notice, say rebuke, and then say outnumber. So we're about to sing. And if you need to respond to this message in any way, you can come tell me about that. But let's stand and let's sing and let's worship the God who has the power to change your mind.